Lecture: Theory of Empire Formation in the 21st Century. Session 1. Introduction and Problem Definition in the 21st Century. Dr. Rami-Georg Johann, author of Theory of Empire Formation in the 21st Century and World Order, Manifesto for the 21st Century, the 1,000-Year Project. Thematic focus of the session. This first session deals with three central developments: the transformation of the world order, the decline of unipolar US hegemony, as well as Hans Morgenthau's model of direct opposition as a classical explanatory pattern. Welcome to the first lecture in the field of international relations, on the topic, Theory of Empire Formation in the 21st Century. My name is Rami-Georg Johann, and in the coming weeks we will engage with a theoretical approach that not only complements the classical theories of international relations, but also questions their fundamental assumptions and further develops them. This lecture understands itself not only as an analysis of existing world politics, but also as a contribution to a central question of our time. What might a stable and just world order look like in the 21st century? Before we go deeper, I would like to pose a fundamental question to you. What do you actually understand by an empire? Do you perhaps think of historical examples such as the Roman Empire or the British Empire? Or do empires possibly still exist today, only in a transformed form? It is precisely at this point that our lecture begins. Why this topic is relevant today. The central motivation of this lecture series lies in a profound transformation of the international order. For a long time, classical theories of international relations, especially realism and liberalism, proceeded from relatively stable structures of power. After the end of the Cold War, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world order seemed clear. The United States of America stood as the dominant superpower at the top of a unipolar system. This phase is often referred to as the unipolar moment. But it is precisely this model that is now visibly beginning to crumble. What does empire formation mean in the 21st century? In the classical understanding, an empire was characterized by three central features: territorial control, military superiority, direct political rule. In the 21st century, however, we observe a fundamental transformation of forms of power. Power today increasingly manifests itself in other dimensions. Economic dependencies, for example, global supply chains and financial systems. Technological dominance, for example, platform economy, digital infrastructure. Normative power, for example, export of values, soft power. Network structures instead of territorial control. From this arises a central theoretical question. Are modern empires less visible, but possibly just as effective? Positioning within the theory of international relations. This question is not only historically interesting, but highly relevant for theory building, because realism explains power conflicts but offers no lasting solution for peace. Liberalism relies on cooperation but underestimates structural power shifts. Constructivism emphasizes norms but often remains institutionally vague. This is precisely where the theory of empire formation in the 21st century begins. It understands itself as an attempt to connect these approaches and at the same time to transcend them. Learning objective of today's session. At the end of this session, you should understand three central aspects. 1. Why the unipolar system of the post-Cold War era is becoming increasingly unstable. 2. Which factors contribute to the relative loss of power of the United States. 3. How a new, more complex world order develops from this. Are we experiencing the end of hegemony, or merely its transformation? At the end of this first part, I would like to leave you with an open question. How is power primarily defined today, militarily or economically? And perhaps going even further, Do we still need classical hegemonies in the 21st century at all? Or new forms of global order? Part 2. The decline of unipolar US hegemony. After we introduced the problem of the lecture in the first part, we now turn to a central empirical and theoretical phenomenon: the changed role of the United States in the international system, analyzed on the basis of the theory of empire formation in the 21st century. 1. The end of unipolarity. If we look at the current world order, it first becomes apparent that the phase of clear US dominance, which existed especially after the end of the Cold War, is increasingly losing stability. In my dissertation, it is emphasized that the international order has already structurally changed. The United States was the dominant world power for decades, but today we find ourselves in a phase of multipolar shifts in power. This development can be recognized by several factors. The relative influence of the US on the world economy is decreasing, while new actors, especially China, are increasingly appearing self-confident. At the same time, global decision-making processes are becoming more complex, since they can no longer be controlled by a single power, but are the result of competing interests. At this point, an important differentiation is necessary. This is not an absolute decline of the United States, but a shift within the global balance of power. The US remains a central power, militarily, economically, and technologically. However, it is no longer solely dominant. It is precisely this transition from a unipolar to a multipolar structure that represents one of the most important changes in international relations in the 21st century. 2. Foreign policy as a business model. A particularly visible expression of this change is evident in foreign policy under Donald Trump. In my analysis, it becomes clear that his policy does not merely represent a stylistic change, but reveals a deeper structural transformation. Foreign policy is no longer primarily understood as long-term order policy, but increasingly as an economically shaped negotiation. This means, concretely, the slogan, "America First," functions as the guiding principle of a policy that is oriented toward immediate national advantages. Multilateral cooperation is set aside in favor of bilateral agreements, and international relations are thought in categories of winners and losers. Foreign policy is thus understood like a business, in which an advantage for other states is interpreted as a potential disadvantage for the United States. This logic represents a fundamental break with the classical role of the US as a hegemonic power that creates order, which previously strongly relied on international institutions and long-term stability. Count 3. Continuity rather than exception. However, it would be analytically reductive to attribute this change exclusively to the person of Trump. A central point of my theory consists in the fact that this is not an isolated event, but a structural development. Similar tendencies can already be observed under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. The experiences from the military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan led to increasing war fatigue within American society. At the same time, domestic political challenges moved more strongly into the center. Particularly under Obama, it became clear that the United States increasingly questions its role as a global leading power. International responsibility was perceived more selectively, and the willingness to act comprehensively as a world police decreased. From this follows a central insight. The transformation of US foreign policy is structurally conditioned and cannot be explained exclusively in personal terms. 4. Domestic political causes of the shift in power. An essential contribution of my theory to the debate in international relations lies in the close linkage of domestic and foreign policy. The development of US hegemony cannot be explained solely through external factors, but must also be understood in the context of internal societal changes. Support for international missions is declining, globalization is increasingly viewed critically, and domestic problems, such as social inequality or political polarization, are gaining importance. Many citizens therefore ask themselves a fundamental question. Why should the United States assume global responsibility if central problems remain unresolved within its own country? This development has far-reaching consequences. The legitimacy of the hegemonic role of the United States is increasingly eroding within its own society. It thus becomes clear that hegemony is not based solely on material power, but also on societal acceptance. 5. Positioning within the theory of empire. At this point, we arrive at the central theoretical point that distinguishes this lecture from classical analyses. In my theory, I argue that the crisis of US hegemony cannot be viewed in isolation. Rather, it is part of a broader structural crisis of the international order. The existing structures, especially the system of sovereign nation-states, are increasingly reaching their limits. International institutions are losing their capacity to govern, while at the same time, competition between great powers is increasing again. In the Manifesto on World Order in the 21st century, this development is described as a fundamental erosion of political steering capacity despite growing global power. This means the decline of the United States is not the actual problem. It is rather a symptom of a structurally unstable system. Interim conclusion. Part 2. In summary, it can be stated that US hegemony does not disappear suddenly, but gradually transforms. This process is shaped by several factors: global shifts in power, domestic political pressure, changing foreign policy strategies. From a theoretical perspective, however, even more decisive is this transformation makes the limits of the existing international order visible and points to the necessity of new models of global organization. At the conclusion of this section, it can be stated that the decline of US hegemony must not be understood as an isolated or short-term phenomenon. Rather, it is an expression of a profound structural transformation within the international order. This transformation affects not only the shift of power between individual states, but also points to fundamental changes in the way global order is organized at all. In this sense, the relative loss of importance of the United States is less a cause than a symptom of a broader transformation of the international system. Precisely from this arises the central theoretical and political challenge of our time: the question of the future shape of the world order. If the previous models are reaching their limits, the question inevitably arises as to which new forms of global organization can take their place. It is exactly at this point that the further development of this lecture begins. Part 3. The Crisis of Allies and Europe's New Role. After we have analyzed the structural transformation of US hegemony in the second part, a central follow-up question now arises. What effects does this transformation have on the allies of the United States, particularly on Europe? The relative withdrawal of the United States from its traditional leadership role has placed the international system under noticeable pressure, especially on the European continent. For decades, Europe was closely tied to the United States in terms of security policy, economics, and institutions. This transatlantic partnership was long considered a stable pillar of the international order, but it is precisely this stability that is beginning to erode. A particularly striking example of this is provided by the reaction of the then German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, after the G7 summit in 2017 in Italy. In a widely noted statement, she declared that the United States was no longer a reliable partner and that Germany as well as Europe would have to take their fate more strongly into their own hands in the future. This statement marks an important turning point. It signals not only a political irritation, but a fundamental loss of trust within the Western alliance system. However, the challenge lies not only in the relationship with the United States. Europe itself is also in a phase of internal uncertainty and structural tensions. The withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union, known as Brexit, has clearly demonstrated how fragile European integration actually is. Brexit stands symbolically for a deeper problem: the increasing fragmentation within Europe and the difficulty of developing a common political and strategic line. This results in a double dilemma. On the one hand, Europe must respond to the withdrawal of the United States, but at the same time it is confronted with its own internal crises. At this point, the question of alliance policy becomes particularly relevant. The political scientist Heinz Gärtner emphasizes in his work, The USA and the New World, that alliances play a central role for security and defense, but can also have ambivalent effects. On the one hand, alliances strengthen the ability of states to support each other in case of emergency. On the other hand, however, they can also contribute to the escalation of conflicts, because as soon as one alliance partner becomes involved in a conflict, an obligation to support arises for the other members. Paradoxically, the division of the world into many small alliance systems can thus increase the probability of wars. Gärtner therefore highlights an often underestimated aspect: the importance of neutral states. These can act as mediators and contribute to de-escalation, since they are not directly bound by alliance obligations. Positioning within the theory of empire. From the perspective of the theory of empire formation, a structural problem of the existing international order becomes visible at this point. The world is fragmented into competing alliances instead of being embedded in a stable, integrated order. This fragmentation leads to uncertainty in international cooperation, increased potential for conflict, lack of long-term stability. It thus becomes clear that neither classical hegemony nor a system of competing alliances represents a sustainable solution. At the conclusion of this section, it can be stated that the withdrawal of the United States from its traditional leadership role has triggered a noticeable crisis of trust within the Western alliance system. Europe is thereby increasingly forced to develop a more independent political and security role. At the same time, this process is made more difficult by significant internal tensions within the European Union, which hinder a unified strategic orientation. Against this background, it becomes evident that the existing alliance structure does not represent a long-term, stable solution. Rather, it contains, especially in an increasingly fragmented international system, the risk of new conflict dynamics, since mutual obligations within alliances can favor escalation processes. From a theoretical perspective, this leads us to a decisive question. If neither hegemony nor alliance systems can guarantee long-term stability, what form of international order can then ensure peace and security in the 21st century? It is precisely at this point that the central argument of my theory begins in the next part. Part 4. The Solution: The Democratic Empire as a New Theory of International Relations. After we have analyzed in the course of the lecture so far the structural problems of the current world order, the decline of US hegemony, the crisis of alliance systems, and the fragmentation of international structures, the decisive question now arises: what form of political order can ensure stability, peace, and justice in the 21st century? It is precisely at this point that the theory of empire formation in the 21st century begins. 1. Starting point of the theory. The central assumption of my theory is: the existing system of sovereign nation-states is structurally no longer capable of effectively solving global problems. In my manifesto, this situation is described as a fundamental erosion of political steering capacity. We live in a world in which economic processes are globally interconnected. Technological developments know no boundaries. Ecological challenges affect all states simultaneously. The political structures, however, remain nationally limited. It is precisely from this discrepancy that the current system crisis emerges. 2. Critique of existing IR theories. The classical theories of international relations reach their limits here. Realism accepts power conflicts as inevitable. Liberalism relies on cooperation, but underestimates structural inequalities. Constructivism emphasizes norms, but often remains institutionally vague. None of these theories offers a lasting solution for global order. 3. The central idea: from competition to integration. My theory, therefore, proposes a fundamental shift in perspective. Not competition between states, but integration of states becomes the central principle. This means, concretely, the world order should no longer be stabilized through balance of power or hegemony, but through a constitutional, democratic integration of political systems. 4. The concept of the democratic empire. At the center stands the concept of the democratic empire. It is important here to avoid misunderstandings. This empire is not a classical empire in the historical sense. It is not based on military conquest, territorial expansion, coercive rule, but rather on voluntary fusion of democratic states, core elements of the democratic empire. This model comprises several central principles. 1. Fusion instead of competition. States do not unite in competition, but form a common political entity. 2. Constitution and rule of law. The order is based on a common constitution and universal legal principles. 3. Democratic legitimacy. Power is not exercised hegemonically, but legitimized through participation. 4. Common value base. Human rights, freedom, and equality form the normative foundation. 5. Theoretical positioning. Thus, the democratic empire represents a new category within international relations. It is neither a classical state, nor a loose alliance, nor a hegemonic order, but rather a post-national constitutional world order. In my theory, this model is described as the fifth concept, as an alternative to multipolar systems of competition, bipolar bloc orders, fragmented alliance systems. 6. Aim of the model. The central goal is the long-term stabilization of the world order through reduction of conflicts, overcoming of power competition, institutional safeguarding of peace. In contrast to historical empires, stability is to emerge here without war. 7. Why? This model is necessary. The necessity of this approach arises directly from the problems analyzed earlier. Hegemony is unstable. Alliance systems are conflict-prone. Nation-states are overburdened. From this follows, a new form of global order is not optional. It is structurally necessary. Conclusion. In summary, it can be stated that the theory of empire formation in the 21st century does not interpret the current transformation of the world order as a crisis without perspective, but as a transition into a new phase of political organization. The visible disintegration of existing structures is, in this understanding, not an endpoint, but an expression of a process of transformation that reveals the limits of the previous system while simultaneously making clear the need for new models of order. Against this background, the concept of the democratic empire represents an attempt to fundamentally rethink the logic of international politics. Power is no longer to be exercised primarily through competition and dominance, but to be transferred into binding legal structures, while rivalry is replaced by a form of integration based on common principles, institutional legitimacy, and lasting cooperation. Final statement. If the world can no longer be stabilized through balance of power, then it must be stabilized through a common order. The democratic empire is the attempt to conceptualize precisely this order in the 21st century.